Welcome back, everybody. This is the Real Side Media. I know we've been gone for about 2 weeks, but this week we are going to be starting a new course, which is this book right here, Methods, which has to do with science toward behavior and experience. So let's dive in. So in this chapter, we are going to be speaking about science as a way of knowing, and then also the scientific approach and early approaches. So we are going to be splitting this chapter up into 2 different videos. We're going to be talking about those 3 concepts in this video today. So the other things in the next section, or the next part that we are going to be filming, is going to be looking at studying behavior and experience, behavior, the subjective experience of research and participants, and then also the people who perform science. Now we're in chapter 1, which is what is science? So science is ingrained deeper into our spirit more than some may think. So we actually know science deeper than we may actually understand. We learn through interactions with our world and the world around us, through passive observations and also active interactions. So we as children slowly learn about the world. So an example would be, we as children, when something caught our eye, we first examined it, studied it, observed it, and experienced it. Hence, that is our observational learning. Okay, so to have an idea about nature of the world is simply not enough. So we need more than just an observation of nature and the world. Having direct experience allows us to further bridge the gap between our ideas and reality. So those observations are necessary. And then we also see that in science, we use doubt to question our research and ask whether factors other than the ones that we originally considered might have influenced our results. So science is a combination of interaction with the world and logic. So further in this section of what is science, science is the process that consists of experiencing the world and then drawing general conclusions called facts from our observations. So we see that scientific understanding helps us to see how and why of the world, and thereby to understand nature in a fuller perspective. So the how and the why, we are going to see that that is a main factor in behavior and experience within this whole book. So in many cases, this understanding raises new questions, which in turn can be answered by using science to examine the world. So we used science to examine the world. At its best, science begins and ends in the human experience. The 3 key roles of science, we see that we have the scientist, the researcher participant, and the witness. So the scientist is in study of behavior and experience. It is the scientist who experiences the world and then formulates general facts and conclusions to describe it, wherein we then see the research participant take place, which this is the one who is being studied during the experiment from the scientist and or researcher. And then we also need an outside source, which is the witness, which provides the perspective, the concerns for value, and the relationship of science and its facts and other aspects of human life. So we do need a third party in order to make sure that there is not an increase of biases. Keep in mind that science is not only the way to study behavior and experience, okay? So science just is another form of knowing. And like any form of knowing, there is limitations. Every kind of form of knowing, there is going to be a limitation behind it. So science is one way of examining human processes. An important aspect of learning about psychology is the process of determining whether a new idea is accurate or not. So science helps us to know if our ideas about the world are wrong or not. They help strengthen those ideals. The author of this book actually believes that the best way to respond to a new idea, especially in society at large, is to use science to evaluate these new ideas and then use the results of the research to help make a decision. Since we are talking about science as a way of knowing, we have to look at different factors, different ways of knowing. One being tenacity. which tenacity is referred to the acceptance of a belief based on the idea that we have always known it to be this way. So keep in mind, even an empty phrase repeated often enough becomes accepted as true. So maybe some false narratives, anything like that, you could end up believing that. So there are two problems with this tenacity method. The first being that the statement may be just an empty phrase and its accuracy may never have been evaluated. So it may have just been said but never evaluated. Secondly, tenacity offers no means for correcting erroneous ideas. So social psychologists have shown that once a person accepts a belief without data to support it, the person often will make up a reason for accepting a belief as true. So that's happened and continues to happen throughout the course of history. Some may even refuse to accept new information that contradicts this belief, which we see a lot of people being super strong with their beliefs. It's understandable, but we have to understand that there is some other factors to be evaluated. So merely accepting ideas about experience and behavior simply because they are familiar to us or widely believed by others is an extension of our childish behavior of when we were 3 years old, when we would copy words and behaviors of others. Another way of knowing is this idea of authority. It is the second way we begin to accept new ideas, and is when an authority figure tells us it is so. So acceptance based on authority is simply because we only have to repeat and live by what we are told. So in most cases, to an authority, especially in areas in which we know nothing is useful or beneficial, as children our parents often used this method of authority for directing our behaviors. So they were the ones who were our authority figure. They looked over us. They told us what was good, what was bad, and we just presumed that those things were good and bad. So this is the idea of authority, which is the one way of knowing. An example is when consulting with physicians, psychologists, scientists, etc., we look for their authority. So one major problem with authority can be seen as authority can be incorrect and thus send people into the wrong direction. This next section was pretty fun. We talk about Galileo, the transition from authority to empiricism. So this idea of authority, we saw that our world used to actually be operated based on the church. So this church came before, religious beliefs came before, then the scientific approach came. So the church looked to the Greek philosopher, actually Aristotle, for answers to the material questions, what today is called the natural sciences. So Aristotle's theory stated that the world is made up of 4 elements: earth, air, water, and fire. So Aristotle stated that each element acts in according to its own nature. So where we see Galileo take place is he was successful in replacing the method of authority with that of experimentation. So he invented things such as the telescope, the thermometer, the microscope, and also the pendulum timing device. So Galileo was the one who was successfully challenged the authority of Aristotle concerning 2 falling weights. So Galileo actually introduced a new way of evaluating science, i.e. through the observation and experience. So our observation and experience and experimentation. And part of the revolution to challenge authority. That's what Galileo's main purpose was throughout history. Third way of knowing is reason. So reason and logic are the basic method of philosophy within itself. We see that we all use reason every day as we try to solve problems and understand relationships around us. So the problem with reason alone is that the reasoned approach is that the original assumption must be correct. So our original assumption of the reasoning must be correct. This is not always the case, okay? So the weakness of using reason alone is that we have no way to determine the accuracy of our own assumptions. So we must look at reason and logic and evaluate those things. So in this slide, we got my man Thomas Paine, the founder of the idea of common sense. And this idea of common sense is a way of knowing. Common sense is based on our own past experiences and our perceptions of the world. So we live in a world where our perceptions can lead us to incorrect conclusions, and there are biases in the way that we individually think. So an example that the book gave us was there are cognitive illusions that lead us to believe that something is certain when it may actually be wrong. So we see that social psychology has shown that we make different psychological attributions depending on whether we observe or participate in a given situation. So common sense may help us deal with the routine aspects of our daily life and may also form a wall and prevent us from understanding new areas. So now we see this different perspective shift with Sigmund Freud, which suggested that we do not always know our own motives, whereas B.F. Skinner suggested that concepts of free will as being inapplicable to the behavior of most individuals. So common sense is very important, not so common nowadays, but it is a way of knowing, and we must evaluate the various ways of knowing so we can understand what the full truth could be. As we're looking at science as a way of knowing throughout history, we see that this gentleman named Alfred North Whitehead in 1925 suggested that there are two methods for what he called the purification of ideas, and that these methods are combined in the scientific method. One being dispassionately observing by the means of our bodily senses, vision, hearing, and touch, so our senses. And then also, secondly, using reason to compare various theoretical conceptualizations based on experience. So an operational definition direct how observations are to be made and what is to be observed and measured. So logic is combined with experience to rule out assumptions that do not accurately reflect the scientific experiment. So an important technique that we see happening after Alfred Whitehead had suggested this ideal of operational definitions, this idea of replication. So replication is where procedure is repeated under similar conditions. So replication allows that the scientific conclusions are never taken as final, but are always open to reinterpretation as new evidence becomes available. The refining of ideas through both experimentation and reason further allows science to be a fruitful method for knowing about the world. So replication is very important because we need to be able to actually replicate a study to make sure that there is some validity there. So keep that in mind. So another thought leader in this idea of knowing, which is Sir Isaac Newton in the 17th century, which he created the modern scientific approach written over 300 years ago. This idea of the law of parsimony, the assumptions that there exists a unity to the physical universe in which we live, the possibility of generalizing from experiments, and the acceptance of empirical data over opinion. So replication is the center or the central to doing good science. So ultimately, the scientific approach helps us to draw valid inferences from our research in describing the world. Let's look at Newton's rules for reasoning, some ways of knowing. So Newton's theory of time and space and motion, as well as the rules of reasoning for science, was explained in his book in the 1680s, this book called Principia. And Newton called science the natural philosophy, which is based on 4 rules of reasoning. Rule 1 being law of parsimony, which is the natural events should be explained in the simplest way possible. Rule 2, Newton's belief of natural order, which requires that the same gravity causes stones to fall in Europe as it does in America. Rule 3, briefly, it states that what we learn from our experiments can actually be applied to similar structures outside the reach of our experiments. And then also lastly, Rule 4, which simply states that theories obtained that experiments should be considered true and approximately true until new experimental evidence shows the old to be incorrect. So now we're getting into the pseudoscience section and superstition. So we see that the goal of this book is to help us think critically. So the book specifically emphasizes that the ways that we evaluate information and come to valid conclusions. So it helps us to evaluate the information and then helps us to validate them and then come to our own conclusions. So we may emotionally believe that something is true and hate the thought of giving up a particular idea or belief. This happens all the time, I know, in my life. I don't know about you guys. Let me know. And as research shows, when we believe something to be true, we tend to look only for supporting evidence and to dismiss any contradictions to our beliefs as an exception. So we've seen this happen within the media and the life in society nowadays after CVID, you know. So without a method to test our ideas, without any specific method to test our ideas, we will never know the validity of our conclusions. So be warned that a variety of individuals make claims in the name of science that are not actually based on rigorous scientific procedures. So I don't know, you could take that with a grain of salt, but just keep that in mind. What is pseudoscience? So pseudoscience is the phenomena of presenting information as if it is based on science when it is not. So pseudo actually means false, which pseudoscience is false science. So usually pseudoscience is based on testimonials. So these are testimonials, keep that in mind, pseudoscience, which present only one side and have not been evaluated by others studying similar phenomena using valid scientific methods. So you won't see any pseudoscience being presented in any peer-reviewed journals. So we must look for validity, and that's where peer reviewed journals shine. So peer review is evaluation of scientific, academic, or professional work by others working in the same field. So this will help with a third party to be able to observe those things to make sure that there are no biases. And this book will actually help us identify pseudoscience and to develop some of the skills of critical thinking to evaluate the claims that we have. Scientific approach, we see that the major characteristics of science is a reliance on information that is verifiable through experience. So that's what this book is about, behavior and experience. So we're going to be seeing that quite a bit through this next course. So it must be possible for different people in different places at different times using a similar method to produce the same results. That creates a more valid scientific approach. We evaluate science as a method of knowing about the world that includes the behavior and experience of yourself and others. So you will then be in a position to decide whether science is the way you choose to understand the world. So you can choose how you understand the world through the different reasonings, through the different approaches. In this next section, early approaches, we're going to be looking at different early approaches that were taking place through different time frames. So this idea of extrasensory perception, which is known as ESP, was integrated during 560 to 540 BC in Persia and Greece. It is related to the Persian War and to the king Croesus, which was looking for an oracle to tell them the outcome of what the war was going to be. So he was looking for how the war was going to turn out, which side was going to win. And they found that only one of the oracles, the Oracle of Delphi in Greece, actually gave the correct answer. In fact, this oracle answered the question asked before it was even asked. So he answered it before it was even asked. The ESP, or the extrasensory perception, actually soon started to lose credibility because they ended up losing that war. This is a different approach. So the next approach is Galen, which is in the 2nd century AD, which was looking at this individual with insomnia through what we now call a single case experiment. So he was looking at a single individual as opposed to a population and or outcome of a population or event. And he looked to examine a number of alternatives to help with the irregular pulse during the insomnia patient's sleeping experience. Because instead of looking at the insomnia itself, he decided to look at the pulse during that time. So he was looking at different factors to see why certain things were happening. So a next approach that is very, very influential in our society today, that has helped save many of the lives, is Ignaz Semmelweis, which he was faced with a series of problems when he noticed that previously healthy women who had just given birth to healthy children were dying. So back in the day, children used to die more frequently. So Semmelweis actually suggested that it was the physicians who were transferring the disease from pathological tissues to healthy mothers, just as assistants had accidentally infected himself with a knife cut. So he found out that specifically physicians that were taking part in these births were not washing their hands. And this actually increased in the deaths and the death rate of women giving birth. And this has actually caused an impact nowadays. So now there are procedures that take place so that operations can go as fluid as possible without any diseases or pathogens spreading. So we see in these early approaches that the choice of basing our actions on evidence from experience or on unfounded opinion probably has been with us in some form or fashion throughout thousands of years and currently confronts us countlessly every day. So basing one's actions on direct experience of the world sometimes appears time-consuming and more difficult than simply consulting with some expert or acting on a hunch. So when simple common sense and reason are combined with direct sensory experience, a desire to understand reality, and the courage to accept new facts, science emerges as a powerful means for asking and answering questions about reality. So where we had the idea of observation and observing the world around us, that was not enough. Having science that bridges the gaps between logic and reality. So with just our observation alone, we will not ultimately know the full potential of reality. That is where science actually shines. And then we saw that Semmelweis was successful because he began with a problem and followed it through to the end by the means of a series of observations. So he took not one observation, not two, he took multiple observations over time, and he followed it through to figure out the problem and issue that had taken place. So scientific approaches often use multiple measures for gaining more complete information concerning a topic. This is the last part of this first part of the chapter. We're going to be having a second part take place. So this is the overview of the science of knowing and what is science. So described in this section of the chapter, we learned that scientific approach to problem solving and what that was. We saw that science combines experience, reason, and the desire to answer questions about the concepts of reality. And then lastly, scientists create theories to help explain their experiences in the world. And that is what bridges the gap between us just being able to observe and us getting actual data. I appreciate you guys coming this week. We're going to be coming out with the second part of this chapter next week. Stay tuned. If you have any questions, anything that you'd like me to break down further, please email me at therealpsychmedia@gmail.com. I appreciate you guys, and I will see you next week.